The cold came off the Monongahela River like it had a personal grudge, riding the November wind down Braddock Avenue and straight through the gaps in Nora Castillo's second-hand coat. She stood on a cracked sidewalk in front of what the city of Braddock, Pennsylvania called a property, and what the rest of the world would call a catastrophe, staring at a building that looked like it had been dying for 40 years and was finally close to finishing the job. Behind her, leaning against the rusted door of their 2002 Chevy Impala with the heater that only worked on its own terms, her 11-year-old son, Marco, watched her with the kind of stillness that children learn when they've seen their parents afraid too many times. Beside him, 8-year-old Rosa pressed her nose against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass in little clouds that disappeared before the next one formed. The auction certificate crinkled in Nora's coat pocket when she reached for it. $10. She had paid $10 for whatever this was. The building stretched half a city block, 4 stories of deteriorated brick and collapsed roof sections, windows long since shattered and boarded over with plywood that had since warped and split. A chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire ran the perimeter, but sections of it had been pushed flat years ago and now lay half-buried under dead weeds and broken glass. A hand-painted sign from some long-past abatement effort still clung to the fence in one corner. Hazardous structure. Keep out. Authorized personnel only. The metal letters on what remained of the facade read, Hartwell Precision Gem Works, the S and S having fallen away at some point and taken with them the record of whatever this place had once been proud of. Gem Works, a diamond factory, according to the sparse city records she'd found during her 3 days of desperate research. Built 1921. Closed 1979. 5 different owners since then, each one walking away, each one apparently deciding that whatever this building represented wasn't worth the trouble of figuring out. Now it was hers. $10, a stack of liability paperwork, and a prayer she hadn't entirely believed in since the layoff started. Marco climbed out of the car and came to stand beside her without being asked. He was doing that more lately, positioning himself close enough to be useful if she needed him, and old enough to feel the weight of things, but young enough that she still needed to pretend everything was manageable for his sake. "What do you think?" she asked him, not because she expected a useful answer, but because asking felt better than standing there in silence with her private terror. Marco studied the building with the seriousness of someone assessing a chess position. He had her dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, that particular combination that had once made her laugh and now just made her heart ache in a complicated way she didn't have time to examine. "I think it's got good bones," he said finally. "You always say that about houses." She looked at him. "When do I say that?" "When we watch those shows on your phone, the ones where people buy wrecked-up places and fix them. I know you always say it's got good bones when it looks really terrible. That's because it's what you say when you're trying to see the potential." Marco nodded at the factory. "Then this one's got good bones." The laugh that came out of her surprised them both. It started in her chest and moved upward before she could stop it. The kind of laugh that lives right next to crying. The kind that comes when the absurdity of a situation reaches a tipping point, and the only alternative is to fall apart. Rosa had gotten out of the car now and wrapped both her arms around Nora's waist from behind, pressing her face against Nora's back. She was a child who communicated through touch, always had been. Even as a baby, she'd screamed until she was held and gone silent the moment she was. "Are we going to go inside?" Rosa asked, her voice muffled by coat fabric. "Keep soon," Nora said. "We're just looking first." "What we always do." Marco gave her a sidelong look that was too knowing for 11. He understood that looking first was sometimes a way of delaying the moment when the looking confirmed what you already feared. But neither of them said anything. They stood on the sidewalk in Braddock, Pennsylvania, in the cold November air, staring at $10 worth of ruin, while somewhere in Nora's chest, a small and stubborn thing that refused to be extinguished continued to insist that this was not the end of their story. It was just the most complicated beginning she'd ever tried to find her way into. 4 months earlier, Nora Castillo had been a different person. Not better, exactly, but simpler, steadier. She'd been a quality control supervisor at Meridian Pharmaceutical Packaging, a plant out on Route 22 that employed 400 people doing the unglamorous work of packaging pills, vials, and medical supplies for distribution across the eastern seaboard. Not a glamorous job. Not something she'd dreamed of as a girl growing up in the south side of Pittsburgh, watching the old men talk about what the mills used to be. But it was her job, and she was good at it. And it paid $52,000 a year with benefits, which was enough to rent a 3-bedroom house in Swissvale, enough to keep Rosa in piano lessons and Marco in the robotics club at school, enough to be a real life and not just a survival exercise. 9 years she'd worked at Meridian, started as a line inspector right after her marriage collapsed, back when she needed something solid to hold on to, and the plant was hiring. And she'd climbed her way up through consistency and the particular stubbornness that runs in her family, like a gene. Learn at every system, every protocol, every regulation governing their work. Became the person the floor manager called when something was wrong that nobody else could diagnose. Became the person newer employees went to when they didn't understand something and were afraid to ask the supervisor. She'd been told twice in recent years that she was on a management track. Had started to believe it. Then, in June, Meridian announced that a significant portion of its packaging operations was being relocated. The word relocated did a lot of work in that announcement. It relocated 400 jobs to a contract facility in Monterrey, Mexico. It relocated Nora's security out from under her feet, so quickly she didn't fully feel it until she was already falling. The severance was 12 weeks, which had sounded almost adequate in the conference room, where they distributed the forms, but felt thinner every week. She'd applied everywhere. The pharmaceutical companies in Pittsburgh, the medical device manufacturers, the food processing plants that had similar quality control needs, the warehouses, the distribution centers. She'd applied for jobs she was overqualified for, and jobs she probably wasn't qualified enough for, and she'd heard back from a few of them, and interviewed for fewer, and been offered nothing. The gap between what she'd earned and what was available was a canyon she kept trying to cross and kept not reaching the other side of. The rent came due on the 1st of each month with the indifference of the calendar. The car payment came on the 15th. Utilities rolled through on their own schedules. The kids' school supplies, their winter coats, the permission slips for field trips that cost $14, the orthodontist appointment for Marco that she'd already postponed twice. Money left the account faster than she could make sense of it. By October, she'd done the math so many times it felt like a punishment, and the answer was always the same. She couldn't stay in the Swissvale house. She couldn't afford it without a job at something close to her old salary, and that job wasn't materializing. She'd given 30 days' notice to the landlord, packed everything into boxes with the help of her mother and her cousin Diane, and moved herself and her children into her mother's 2-bedroom apartment in Munhall. Her mother, Graziella, who was 63 years old and retired from a lifetime of cleaning offices and raising a family on a budget that never quite reached the edges of what was needed, had opened her door without hesitation and without complaint. But the apartment was small, and Graziella's health wasn't what it had been, and there were 4 people sharing a space meant for one, and the kindness of it made the situation feel both better and worse at the same time. Marco and Rosa slept in the 2nd bedroom on a blow-up mattress, surrounded by Graziella's boxes of things she'd been meaning to sort through for years. Nora slept on the couch, which was a perfectly acceptable couch for sitting on, and a particular kind of torture to sleep on. Her mother never said a word about any of it. That silence was its own form of grace, and also its own form of weight. 3 weeks into living on her mother's couch, Nora had $600 left and a resume that had been sent into an electronic void 47 times. She was awake at 12:30 in the morning, the apartment dark and quiet around her. Marco and Rosa asleep. Graciela asleep. The city outside the window doing that thing it does in the small hours where it holds its breath. Nora was on her phone scrolling through job listings because she couldn't sleep, and it was the only thing she knew how to do with the anxiety that lived in her chest, now like a second heartbeat. She wasn't finding anything she hadn't already applied for. She'd been through the legitimate job boards 3 times that week and was now deep in the stranger corners of the internet, or clicking through links that led to other links when something redirected her to a page she hadn't been looking for. Allegheny County Tax Lien Property Auction. Current listings. She almost closed it. She wasn't looking for property. She had nowhere near enough money to do anything with property. But the page was already loaded, and she was awake, and the listings were there, and it cost nothing to look. Most of it was what she expected. Residential lots in neighborhoods that had been declining for 2 decades. Vacant parcels where houses had been demolished. A few commercial properties in various states of deterioration. She scrolled past them without slowing down until one listing stopped her hand mid-motion. Hartwell Precision Gem Works, 217 Braddock Avenue, Braddock, Pennsylvania. Lot size 0.78 acres. Structure 42,800 square feet. 4 stories. I classification, industrial. Condition, condemned. Minimum bid, $10. Auction closes in 11 hours. Her first thought was that $10 had to be a typo. Her second thought was that condemned meant uninhabitable, dangerous, a liability rather than an asset. Her third thought, the one she couldn't quite get rid of, was that 42,000 square feet was 42,000 square feet, and she had been a quality control supervisor for a pharmaceutical plant, which meant she understood buildings, understood systems, understood the difference between structural damage that was cosmetic and structural damage that was catastrophic, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge was worth something here. She read every word of the listing twice. The city's description was legally cautious to the point of being nearly useless. A property conveyed as is where is. Buyer assumes all liability. No warranties expressed or implied. Environmental assessment incomplete. Occupancy prohibited pending structural and environmental review. She searched for the building. Found the name Hartwell Precision Gem Works in a few places. A local history website about Braddock's industrial past. A short mention in a Pittsburgh newspaper article from 2018 about the challenges of redeveloping abandoned properties in the Mon Valley. The factory had been founded in 1921 by a man named Ezra Hartwell, a diamond cutter and polisher who'd immigrated from Antwerp and established one of the few gem processing operations in western Pennsylvania. The factory had cut and polished diamonds for jewelry manufacturers throughout the mid-Atlantic region during its years of operation. It had employed at its peak just over 60 workers. It had closed in 1979 when the industry shifted toward offshore cutting facilities in India and China, the same economics that had been killing American manufacturing in various forms for the past century. The founder, Ezra Hartwell, had died in 1976, 3 years before the factory closed. His family, according to the history website, had sold it shortly after his death to a real estate developer who intended to convert it to loft apartments, a plan that never materialized. The developer had sold it to another developer. That developer had sold it to the city during a tax foreclosure in 1994. The city had held it since then, making various attempts to attract redevelopment interest, spending money on basic stabilization work twice, and ultimately deciding that the liability outweighed the benefit of holding it any longer, Hence the $10 auction. Nora sat with her phone on her chest in the dark living room of her mother's apartment and looked at the ceiling. The couch made its familiar small noise when she shifted her weight. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked. $600. She had $600. If she spent $10 on the auction, she'd have $590 left, which wasn't meaningfully different from $600 in terms of what it could actually accomplish. She wasn't going to be able to pay rent anywhere with either amount. She wasn't going to fix her situation with $600. But a building. A building was a different kind of thing. A building was an address. A building was something that existed in the physical world. Something that a person could stand inside and be, technically, housed. She thought about Marco asking whether it was going to be like camping. She thought about Rosa's face in the car window. She thought about the couch. She bid $10 at 12:47 in the morning, sitting in her mother's dark living room in her pajamas, with a blanket pulled up to her chin. Her thumb hovered over the confirm button for 14 seconds before she pressed it. When the screen refreshed to show her as the current high bidder, she felt a sensation that she would later struggle to describe accurately. It was not excitement. It was not hope, exactly. It was something quieter and stranger than either of those. The feeling of a person who has been falling and has just grabbed hold of something, not knowing yet whether that something will hold. Or she won the auction at 11:43 the following morning for $10 plus $180 in processing fees and transfer taxes. She found this out during her shift at the coffee shop, where she'd been working part-time for the past 6 weeks. The job she'd taken because it was something. And something was what she needed, even when something paid $11 an hour and left her smelling like espresso. The city's property management office sent a confirmation email with a link to schedule document pickup. The email was formatted with the cheerful indifference of automated bureaucracy and contained no acknowledgement of the fact that someone had just paid a tenth of the price of a decent meal for a 42,000 square foot condemned industrial building. She showed the email to exactly one person, her cousin Diane, who looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then Diane said, "Mija, that building is on the news every other year because kids get hurt in it." Nora said, "I know." Diane said, "The city has been trying to get rid of that thing since I was in high school." Nora said, "I know that too." Diane looked at her over the phone screen with an expression that occupied the uncomfortable space between concern and judgment. "And you paid $10, plus fees." "Nora, what exactly is your plan here?" Nora had thought about this on the bus home from the coffee shop, had been turning it over for hours. "At minimum, I have an address, a real address where we can be. Once I get the structural report and the environmental assessment, I'll know what I'm actually dealing with. And then? And then I figure out the next step from there. That's not a plan. That's a series of steps with no destination. Sometimes that's the only kind of plan you get," Nora said. Diane had shaken her head slowly in the way she did when she thought Nora was making a mistake, but had decided not to fight about it. She loved Nora in that particular way, of the family members who have watched you be determined about things and learned that determination was non-negotiable. She said, "What does your mother think?" "She doesn't know yet." Diane's eyebrows went up. Then she said, "You need to tell her before she finds out some other way." And Nora, "I know." Her mother's reaction, when she told her that evening after the kids were in bed, was more complicated than either approval or disapproval. Graziella sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at the auction confirmation for a while. Then she looked at her daughter. "A diamond factory," she said. "Yes. You remember nothing about diamonds. I know what diamonds are." Graziella's mouth pressed together in the way it did when she was deciding how much to say. "Your grandfather," she said finally. "Your father's grandfather bought a piece of land once, $100. Someone told him it was worthless, and he could get it for almost nothing, and he thought that was opportunity. It turned out to have an old landfill under it, and it cost him twice what the land was worth just to deal with the problems. Nora thought about the city's environmental assessment caveat. "I understand the risk," she said. "Do you? Do you really understand it?" Nora looked at her mother. "If I stay here another month, I'm going to lose my mind, Mama. Not because of you. I want you to understand that. Not because of anything you're doing. It's because we're in a situation that has no forward movement, and I can't sit still in a situation with no forward movement. I need to be doing something, or I'm going to fall apart." Graziella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 months." Nora felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been wound tight. "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." Her mother looked at the auction confirmation again, then folded it once along the center line and pushed it back across the table. "Then you go look at your diamond factory," she said, "and you tell me what you find. But you take the children somewhere warm first. This is not something they need to see until you know what it is." The property management office was on Forbes Avenue in downtown Pittsburgh, a building that smelled like decades of government work and had fluorescent lights that flickered on a cycle no one had ever fixed. A man named Dennis Hartwick, mid-50s, reading glasses perpetually halfway down his nose, hands over the deed and the property packet, with the efficiency of someone who had transferred many distressed properties and expected nothing good to come of any of them. He was not unkind. He was simply realistic in the way that people who manage the consequences of other people's failures often become. "You've seen the property?" he asked. "Not inside yet." Hartwick looked at her over his glasses. "There are significant liability concerns. The 3rd floor has 2 collapsed sections. The roof is compromised in the north wing. There may be asbestos in the original insulation, though the abatement report from 2009 suggested it was contained. I'd strongly advise a structural engineer before you attempt any entry." "I used to work in industrial quality control," Nora said. "I understand how to read a building." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll need a licensed inspector before the city will issue any kind of occupancy permit, even provisional. Do not attempt to live in that building in its current state. I'm not planning on living in it immediately. I'm planning on assessing it." He handed her the property packet. Inside, a deed, a tax history going back 30 years, a copy of the 2009 environmental report, the most recent structural assessment from 2017, and a hand-drawn diagram of the floor plan that looked like it had been photocopied approximately 40 times and showed its ancestry in every smeared line. He also handed her a key ring with 4 keys, each one labeled with a number in nail polish. "1 is the main entrance on Braddock Avenue," he said. 2 is the loading dock on the south side. 3 and 4, I honestly don't know. They came with the property when we took it over in 1994. She took the keys. They were heavy and mismatched. Different generations of lock hardware gathered on the same ring like a family that had nothing in common except proximity. As she turned to leave, Hartwick said her name. "Ms. Castillo." She looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, "a few different developers have walked through that building over the years. But a few of them got pretty far into planning before the numbers stopped working. What I'm saying is that the building has something. Some quality. I don't know exactly what to call it. It's not just 4 walls and a floor." He paused, as if deciding whether to continue. The original owner, whatever else he was, built that place to last. You can tell when you're inside. It has a density to it, a weight, like it was built by someone who believed whatever was inside it was worth protecting. Nora looked at the key ring in her hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saying something that wasn't entirely discouraging." He nodded. looking slightly embarrassed by his own departure from bureaucratic neutrality. "Good luck," he said, and turned back to his paperwork. The drive to Braddock took 25 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. Nora went alone the first time, leaving Marco and Rosa with her mother under the pretense of running errands. She drove down Braddock Avenue with the property packet on the passenger seat and the keyring on the center console, passing the mural on the library and the community garden and the small businesses that were trying, against the odds that Rust Belt towns perpetually face, to be part of something that didn't feel like an ending. She'd driven through Braddock before, years ago, passing through on the way to somewhere else. It was one of those places that defined itself by what it had been, the steel industry and the Carnegie Steel Works and the Battle of Braddock Field that the town was named for, all of it layered into the landscape like geological strata. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works still ran at the edge of town, one of the few surviving steel operations in the valley, its towers visible from most of the neighborhood, its night sky turning orange in the darkness. The rest of the town was quieter than it had once been. Newer murals on older buildings, houses that showed a spectrum from renovated care to long abandonment. She parked on Braddock Avenue in front of 217 and sat in the car for a full minute. The building looked different in person than it had looked in the city's photos, which had been taken from a distance and an afternoon light that softened the damage. Up close, it was larger and more complicated, and more obviously a thing that had been suffering for a long time. But Hartwick's words had lodged somewhere in her, built by someone who believed whatever was inside it was worth protecting. She got out of the car. The chain-link fence had a gate on the Braddock Avenue side that accepted key number 1. She pushed through it and walked to the main entrance, a set of double doors under a stone archway that had once been ornate and had lost most of its ornamentation to time and weather. Above the arch, carved into the stonework in a font that spoke to 1920s craftsmanship, Hartwell Precision Gem Works, 1921. The carving was deep and clean, the kind of work done by someone who expected it to outlast them. She used key number 1 on the main door. The lock resisted. The mechanism gummed with decades of disuse, and then yielded with a sound that she felt as much as heard. A heavy mechanical surrender. The door swung inward on hinges that complained, but held. The smell that came out was exactly what she'd expected. Concrete dust and old wood and the particular mustiness of sealed space. Water damage from decades of roof leaks. The residue of industrial activity that no amount of time would entirely remove. She stepped inside. Her flashlight cut through the dimness. She'd brought a proper one, not just her phone. A heavy mag light she'd been carrying since her years doing shift inspections at Meridian. The main floor opened before her, a vast space that had once held machinery and now held its ghost. The floor was concrete, cracked in places and stained in patterns that told the story of where equipment had stood and where chemicals had pooled, and where decades of water had found its way from the failing roof. The walls were brick, thick enough that she could feel the mass of them, the thermal weight of all that fired clay absorbing and holding the cold. The ceiling was high, 20 feet or more in the main production area, with steel beam construction that still looked fundamentally sound, even where the roof above it had partially collapsed. She walked slowly, running the flashlight beam along the walls, the floor, the ceiling, reading the building the way she'd been trained to read production systems, looking for the hierarchy of damage, distinguishing between what was cosmetic and what was structural, what could be addressed and what could not. The 2017 structural report had been written in the dense language of engineering assessment, but she'd translated it during her 3 days of research. The south and east walls were in excellent condition. The north wing was compromised, and the collapsed roof sections having admitted years of weather. The interior was contaminated with debris and decades of accumulated material. But the foundational integrity of the main structure was sound. The bedrock that Braddock sat on, the same bedrock that had made it worth building a steel town here in the first place, extended under the factory floor and had been incorporated into the original foundation in a way that spoke to serious engineering. This building had not been built to be temporary. It had been built to outlast the person who built it. She moved through the main production floor to the east, where a corridor led to what the floor plan indicated were office spaces and secondary rooms. The offices were smaller, their windows mostly intact behind plywood boarding, on the spaces retaining more warmth and less water damage than the production floor. Filing cabinets, long since emptied, still stood against walls. A metal desk with both its drawers missing sat in what must have been the foreman's office, a room positioned at the corner of the building where it would have had sight lines across the production floor. On the wall above the desk, a clock with no hands. She stood in the foreman's office for a long moment. The window here was intact behind its board, and light leaked around the edges in thin, bright lines. The floor was a different material than the rest she'd seen. Not the industrial concrete of the production areas, but something older, hexagonal tile in a dark red and cream pattern, and the kind of flooring that spoke to an era when even industrial spaces received the decorative consideration of craftsmanship. She crouched and pressed her palm to the tile. Cold and solid. Good. She stood and moved to the interior wall of the office, running her flashlight along the brickwork. Here the wall was different from the exterior walls. Not load-bearing brick, but a partition, probably added during one of the early decades of operation to create the office enclosure. The partition connected to the main structure at both ends and appeared in the original floor plan, so it was original to the building's early configuration. She nearly missed it. She would have missed it, probably, if she hadn't been doing what quality control had trained her to do, which was to look not just at what was there, but at the negative space, the absences, the things that should be present that weren't. The floor plan showed a wall of approximately 40 feet on the east side of the foreman's office. The actual wall, measured by pacing, was closer to 28. 12 feet unaccounted for. She paced it again. Then again. 32 steps across the full room in the floor plan. 23 steps across the actual room. She moved to the south wall of the office, where the discrepancy would have to resolve itself, and found what she might have taken for a storage alcove, a shallow recess framed by the same partition brickwork, currently occupied by the skeleton of a metal shelving unit that had collapsed inward, its components splayed across the tile in a way that looked random and was probably exactly that. The recess was 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, not large enough to be a room, and certainly not the 12 missing feet. She moved the collapsed shelving piece by piece. It was old, the metal pitted with surface rust, but not structurally compromised, the kind of industrial shelving built for factories in the mid-20th century that could take 40 years of neglect and still be recognizable for what it was. When she'd cleared enough of it away to access the back of the recess, she pressed her palm to the wall. Brick. Old brick. The same vintage as the rest of the partition. But the mortar was different. Not freshly different. Not the recently disturbed kind of different that might suggest tampering in recent years. This was old different, a different era's work, applied after the original construction. She couldn't have explained precisely how she knew this. It was the kind of knowledge that accumulates through years of paying attention to surfaces and materials and the way things age in relation to one another. The mortar in this section was a generation older than the partition it was applied to, which was already old. Something had been here before the shelving. Something had been sealed. She stepped back from the recess and pressed her flashlight beam against the wall at a sharp angle, raking the light across the surface to reveal texture. The brick face was consistent, not disturbed in recent decades. but the mortar joints told a story of at least 2 layers of work, the original setting and a secondary seal applied later, perhaps in the 1970s or early 1980s, based on the color and weathering. She took photographs with her phone, lots of them, from multiple angles. But then she backed out of the alcove, stepped over the collapsed shelving she'd moved, and stood in the middle of the foreman's office with the flashlight in her hand and the blood moving faster in her veins than it had any right to in a condemned building in November. 12 feet. The missing 12 feet of office wall, and behind a brick facade that had been carefully and deliberately sealed. Something. She had no idea what. The thought that crossed her mind first was environmental. Old industrial contamination sealed up by a previous owner hoping to contain a problem. She'd seen that before, had read about it in the history of industrial properties throughout the Mon Valley. But contamination got sealed in walls, not behind them. Contamination got encapsulated. This felt different. This felt deliberate in a different register, or not like a problem being hidden, but like something being protected. She drove back to Munhall in the gray November afternoon, with her hand steady on the wheel and her mind running in tight, fast circles that she couldn't have slowed down if she'd tried. She needed a structural engineer. She needed someone to look at that sealed section with professional eyes before she did anything that could be either dangerous or inadvisable or both. She needed, above all, to not leap to conclusions about something she'd seen once in bad light with a flashlight and a floor plan that might have been wrong to begin with. But she also needed to acknowledge what she'd felt in that foreman's office, in the cold tile room with the handless clock on the wall and the collapsed shelving, and the wall that was 12 feet shorter than it should have been. And she had felt, with a certainty that had no logical basis and could not be explained by anything reasonable, that whatever Ezra Hartwell had built this factory to protect was still here. Waiting. Patient as old stone, as unchanged as the building itself, which had refused to fully collapse despite 4 decades of effort. She pulled into her mother's parking lot and sat for a moment before going inside. Through the windshield, the sky was doing the thing it does in Pittsburgh in November, that heavy gray that sits so low and close it feels personal. Rosa was inside helping Graciela with dinner. Marco was probably on his laptop, the one she'd refused to sell even when selling everything else was on the table. Zeeb because that laptop was his connection to the robotics club and to the network of other kids who thought the way he thought, and she was not willing to take that from him on top of everything else. She had bought a condemned diamond factory for $10. She had found what appeared to be a deliberately sealed section of wall in the original foreman's office. She had about $580 left in her bank account and a part-time coffee shop job and a couch to sleep on, and children who needed her to be right about this because the alternative was a kind of falling she didn't know the bottom of. She got out of the car and went inside and said nothing to anyone about what she'd found. Not yet. Not until she knew what it was. But at dinner that evening, something had shifted in how she held herself. Graciela noticed. She always noticed. She caught Nora's eye across the table while Marco was explaining something about hydraulics to Rosa, who was asking questions. She was probably too young to understand, but asking anyway because she liked the sound of her brother explaining things. Graciela tilted her head the way she did when she was asking a question without words. Nora gave the smallest possible nod. Her mother looked at her for a moment longer, reading whatever she saw in Nora's face with the accuracy that only mothers who have paid close attention to their children for 36 years can achieve. Then she looked down at her plate and let a quiet smile cross her face and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. The structural engineer Nora found was named Patricia Okafor, some black woman in her late 50s who worked out of an office in Squirrel Hill and had a resume that included 30 years of assessments, on everything from Victorian row houses to industrial facilities throughout western Pennsylvania. She came with a recommendation from Nora's cousin Diane, whose husband had used her for a commercial property years back. Patricia charged $400 for a preliminary assessment, which consumed most of what Nora had left and required that she work 2 additional shifts at the coffee shop that week to make sure there was enough left over for groceries. She met Patricia at the factory on a Monday afternoon, key ring in hand, both of them in hard hats that Patricia had brought, steel-toed boots that Nora had borrowed from Diane, and Patricia spent 2 hours walking the building while Nora followed and listened and tried to understand what she was seeing. The engineer moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been inside worse places and come out with good information. She took her own measurements, made her own notes, photographed the damage sections with the efficient thoroughness of professional practice. At the north wing, she shook her head once at the roof collapse. At the main production floor, she crouched and pressed her palm to the concrete, the way Nora had done in the foreman's office. At the exterior east wall, she ran her fingers along the mortar joints and nodded slowly. When they reached the foreman's office, Nora had already moved the collapsed shelving back into place. She didn't want to direct Patricia's attention to the sealed section before hearing the engineer's general assessment. She wanted an uninfluenced opinion of the building first. Patricia looked at the foreman's office with the same unhurried attention she'd given everything else. She looked at the floor plan Nora had brought, compared its measurements to the room. Then she moved to the south wall of the office and began pacing. She paced once, then again. Then she turned to look at Nora. "You already know," she said. "About what?" Patricia pointed at the south wall. "About the discrepancy." Nora kept her expression neutral. "I noticed the measurements didn't match." Patricia nodded. 12 feet, give or take. She moved to the south wall and examined the brickwork in the shallow recess, still partially occupied by the shelving that Nora had replaced. She ran her fingers along the mortar joints the way she'd run them along the exterior wall, but with more focused attention. "Secondary seal," she said, "applied after the original construction. Based on the weathering pattern and the mortar composition, I'd estimate this was sealed sometime in the 1960s or early 1970s. Nora's heart was moving faster. Before the factory closed. Before it closed, Patricia agreed. This is deliberate. Whoever did this was careful. They matched the brick facing well enough that it's not obvious unless you're looking for it. Nora watched Patricia work. "What do you think is behind it?" Patricia turned to look at her with the expression of someone who has learned not to speculate. "I don't know. What I know is that it's structural brickwork over a void. There's space behind this wall. Based on the floor plan dimensions, 12 feet of it, probably running the full depth of this room in the eastward direction. What I can tell you is that the original building has a subsurface component. The 1921 construction plans, if we could find them, would probably show a basement level. Most factory buildings of this era had them. Whether that subsurface component connects to whatever is behind this wall, I can't say without opening it. Is the building structurally sound enough to open it?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ceiling, then at the walls, then at the floor. The office section is in the most stable part of the structure. The south and east walls are original load-bearing construction with no significant compromise. This partition is not load-bearing. It was added later, and it's not doing anything structural. If you removed this section carefully, with proper bracing protocols just in case, you would not be affecting the integrity of the building. "You have to understand that I'm not saying open it," she added. "I'm saying that, from a structural standpoint, this section is not load-bearing. What you do with that information is your business." She paused, looked at the sealed wall one more time. "But I'll tell you this. I've been doing assessments for 30 years. I've been in a lot of old industrial buildings. And in my experience, When someone takes this kind of care to seal something, takes the time to do it this carefully, and this well, they're not hiding a problem. They're protecting something they believed was worth protecting. She looked at Nora. You should find out what it is. That night, Nora sat on her mother's couch after everyone was asleep and made 2 lists. The first list was everything that could reasonably be behind the wall. Old equipment that had been decommissioned, contaminated materials from the manufacturing process, documents or records that had never been properly disposed of, building materials from a renovation, the kinds of things that ordinary factories sealed up in ordinary ways for ordinary reasons. She made this list because she believed in facing the realistic possibilities before the unrealistic ones. She made it because quality control had taught her to account for the mundane before chasing the exceptional. The second list she made more slowly. It had only 1 item on it, not because she thought it was the most likely thing, but because it was the one item that the building itself seemed to be pointing toward. A diamond cutting and polishing factory in operation for more than 50 years, founded by a man who had fled Antwerp in the years before the war. A man who had worked with gemstones his entire professional life. A man who, according to what little she'd found, had been private and methodical, and, by the account of the local history website, deeply distrustful of institutions following a childhood shaped by what European Jews of his generation had seen institutions do. A man who had built his factory on bedrock and poured his life into it, and died 3 years before it closed, never seeing the ending he must have known was coming. A man who, by every account, had been the kind of person who believed that what mattered most was worth protecting. The second list had 1 item on it. She looked at it for a long time in the dark of her mother's living room, with the city quiet outside, and her children sleeping behind a wall, and her hands folded on her knees, and the keyring on the cushion beside her. Then she closed the notepad and looked at the ceiling, and allowed herself, for the first time since all of this had started, to feel something that wasn't careful and measured and rationally defensible. She felt it move through her like a current. She felt her daughter sleeping in the next room. She felt her son and the robotic competitions he'd had to miss this fall because of everything. And she felt the couch beneath her and the coat she'd bought at Goodwill and the coffee shop uniform folded by the door for tomorrow's shift. And she made a decision. She was going to open that wall. She told no one what she was planning to do. Not her mother, not Diane, not Marco, and especially not Rosa, who had a gift for worry that far exceeded what an 8-year-old should have to carry, and who had already been carrying too much for too long. Nora drove to the factory alone on a Wednesday morning, when Marco and Rosa were at school, and her mother had her standing appointment at the community center, where she played cards with women she'd known for 40 years. She brought what she'd calculated she would need: a cold chisel and a 2-pound hammer she'd bought at the hardware store for $23. A wrecking bar, borrowed from her mother's basement, where it had been sitting unused behind the water heater since Graciela's late husband had left it there a decade ago. Her mag light, her phone. A dust mask, because the 2009 environmental report had mentioned contained asbestos in the original pipe insulation, and she had no way to be certain what was in the mortar of a wall sealed in the 1960s. Work gloves, the heavy leather kind, a notebook, and a pen, because quality control had made note-taking instinct. The morning was cold, the sky the particular gray of western Pennsylvania in November that gave the impression the light was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She parked on Braddock Avenue and let herself in through the chain-link gate. The city's paperwork was in her bag, the deed and the transfer documents, for on the principle that if anyone official appeared and asked questions, she wanted to have her answers in documentary form. Nobody appeared. The block was quiet. The factory absorbed her the way it always did, drawing her into its particular atmosphere of industrial stillness. the muffled quality of a large interior space that had not heard human occupation in years. She moved through the main production floor with her flashlight, and did not stop to look at it the way she had on previous visits. She moved with purpose, straight to the east corridor, straight to the foreman's office, straight to the south wall, and the recess with the collapsed shelving. She moved the shelving again, piece by piece, stacking it against the opposite wall. The work warmed her hands. When the recess was clear, she stood in front of the sealed section of brickwork and studied it for a long moment. The flashlight held at a shallow angle showed her the details she'd memorized from her previous visit. The facing brick matched carefully to the surrounding wall. The secondary mortar, older than it looked, doing its patient work of seal. She took a photograph. Then she put on her dust mask and her work gloves and picked up the cold chisel. She placed the tip against a mortar joint near the center of the sealed section, about 4 feet up from the floor. She took a breath. She struck with the hammer. The sound rang through the office like a bell, sharp and sudden, entirely out of keeping with the silence that had held the building for so long. The mortar resisted on the first blow, yielded fractionally on the second, and it crumbled at the edge on the third. She worked methodically, the way she did everything, starting with the mortar joints and working outward from the center, loosening the framework before attempting to remove individual bricks. The dust rose in the flashlight beam, pale gray and fine, and she was grateful for the mask. She thought about the 2-minute safety briefing she'd given herself that morning. If the air smelled wrong, she'd leave. If she found anything that looked like chemical contamination or biological material, or anything that made her internal alarm systems fire in the wrong direction, she'd leave and figure out the next step from a position of safety. She was not going to do anything irreversibly stupid. She was going to do the minimum necessary to find out what was there. The first brick came free 20 minutes into the work. It was old, the kind of fired brick made before the standardization of industrial manufacturing, each one slightly different from the next in dimension and color. The kind that people paid considerable money for now, when they found them in demolished buildings and sold them as reclaimed material for boutique construction projects. She set it aside carefully. Behind it was darkness and cool air and nothing visible in the gap. She removed the next brick and the next. She worked in a horizontal row, then dropped to the row below. After 40 minutes, she had an opening roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. The bricks stacked in a careful pile behind her on the tile floor. She shone the flashlight through the opening. The beam illuminated what was beyond, and Nora went still. Absolutely still, the way she'd gone still in doorways when her children were newborns, and she'd stood watching them breathe because the miracle of them was too complete to move through without stopping. Beyond the brick facing was a corridor, narrow, perhaps 4 feet wide, running east into the building's mass. The walls were the original stone foundation, rougher than the brick above grade, the kind of construction that had been built before reinforced concrete changed how people anchored buildings to the earth. The floor was stone as well, the same bedrock that Patricia Okafor had mentioned, flat and cold and solid as the mountain it had been cut from. The ceiling was low, perhaps 6.5 feet, beamed with old timber that showed no sign of rot or compromise. And at the far end of the corridor, perhaps 30 feet in, there was a door. She could see it clearly in the flashlight beam, a door set into the stone wall at the corridor's end, its surface partially obscured by decades of dust, but unmistakable in its design. Heavy, dark metal, the kind of construction that did not belong in a corridor, but in a bank vault. Hinges the size of her forearm. A locking mechanism in the center of the door, the kind with a wheel handle that you turn to disengage multiple bolts simultaneously. Like the door on a ship's bulkhead or a submarine's pressure hatch, the kind of engineering that spoke not just to security, but to serious, professional commitment to keeping something sealed. She stood at the opening she'd made in the brick wall and looked at that door for a very long time. She took a photograph of the corridor and the door. She took several. Then she sat down on the tile floor of the foreman's office with her back against the intact wall and her flashlight in her lap and her dust mask pulled down around her chin. And she breathed. Her mind went through what this meant in the most practical terms available to it. A corridor, a vault door, both of them original to the building, or very nearly so, which meant they predated the 1960s ceiling of the facing wall, which meant someone, presumably Ezra Hartwell, or someone working under his direction, had built this corridor and this door as part of the factory's infrastructure, and had later, at some point, chosen to seal the entrance to it behind a facing of carefully matched brick, and the door at the end of the corridor was locked. She looked at the key ring. She had removed it from her bag and was holding it without being fully aware of having done so, the 4 keys on their ring warming from the heat of her hand. Keys numbered 1 through 4, 2 of which Dennis Hartwick had acknowledged were unknowns, origin uncertain, transferred with the property in 1994 and never identified. Keys 3 and 4. She counted the keys again, looking at them separately. Key 3 was large, similar in scale to Key 1, the main entrance key, though of a different design. Industrial. The barrel was heavier than a standard key. The teeth were more complex. Key 4 was smaller, different again, the kind of key that belonged to a padlock or a secondary lock rather than a primary one. She stood up. She pulled the dust mask back over her nose and mouth, picked up her flashlight, and went to the opening she'd made in the brick wall. The gap was big enough for her to fit through if she angled herself carefully. She shone the flashlight in again, looked at the corridor floor, looked at the ceiling, looked at the walls. No visible hazards. No pooled water. No hanging debris. No smell beyond old stone and cold air. The mineral cleanness of deep, sealed rock. She set the flashlight on the floor inside the opening, pointing down the corridor, climbed through the gap, retrieved the flashlight, and stood up. The corridor was cold in a different way than the factory above. Deeper. More constant. The temperature of the earth itself held steady by the insulating mass of stone, unaffected by the variability of seasons above. Her breath made clouds in the flashlight beam. She walked toward the vault door. Her footsteps on the stone floor made almost no sound, absorbed by the density of the space. The corridor was perfectly straight, perfectly dimensioned, the walls smooth and even in a way that spoke to professional stone-cutting. This had not been carved in a hurry or improvised. This had been planned and executed with precision by people who knew what they were doing and had taken the time to do it right. The vault door was larger up close than it had appeared from the opening. 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, the surface dark with age but the metal sound, no significant rust, where the lubricating mechanism lived, which told her that someone had maintained this at some point, not recently, but not as long ago as the ceiling of the exterior wall. The locking wheel was centered at chest height. Below it, a keyhole. She examined the keyhole. It was the right scale for key 3. She put the key in. It went in completely, seated without resistance, the teeth of the key engaging with the internal mechanism with the precise fit of something designed for exactly this key. She turned it. The lock disengaged, with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, a deep, resonant, mechanical click that moved up through the metal of the key and into her hand, and her arm, and her chest like a vibration rather than a sound. The voice of something that had been waiting a very long time to be spoken to. She took hold of the locking wheel with both hands, turned it counterclockwise. She could feel the bolts moving inside the door, retracting from their seats in the frame, one after another, as the mechanism completed its rotation, each one a small percussion in the metal. When the wheel reached its stop, she pulled. The door swung toward her on hinges that were perfectly balanced, perfectly maintained, moving with a smoothness entirely at odds with the age of everything around it. Whoever had built this door had over-engineered it with the same philosophy that had governed the construction of the factory above it. Build it to last. Build it to endure. Build it as if whatever it protects is worth protecting forever. The space beyond the door was dark. Her flashlight beam moved into it and kept moving, finding no immediate wall to stop against, continuing outward into a darkness that revealed itself slowly as a room. A large room, much larger than the corridor had suggested. She stepped through the doorway. The motion sensors, if that's what they were, activated perhaps 2 seconds after she crossed the threshold. Not electric lights, nothing connected to the factory's power grid, which had been dead for decades, but something else, something chemical. The kind of bioluminescent safety lighting that required no external power source, strips of material embedded in the ceiling that had been activated by the disturbance of the air, and were now beginning to emit a cold, faint, greenish-white glow that spread across the room from the ceiling downward like slow dawn. In that gathering light, Nora Castillo saw what Ezra Hartwell had spent a lifetime building, protecting, and eventually sealing away from a world he no longer trusted to deserve it. She had to sit down on the floor, not because her legs gave out exactly, but because standing felt like the wrong relationship to have with what she was looking at, as if standing implied a casual relationship with what was there, and nothing about this was casual, and her body understood this before her mind did. The room was perhaps 50 feet wide and 40 feet deep, the ceiling 12 feet overhead. The walls were the same dressed stone as the corridor, sealed with a coating that she would later learn was a specialized mineral compound designed to regulate humidity, keeping the interior at a controlled atmospheric condition regardless of seasonal variation outside. The floor was stone, polished smooth. Along each wall, floor to ceiling, ran shelving units built from the same dark metal as the vault door, bolted to the stone with hardware designed for permanence. And on the shelves, organized with the meticulous precision of a man who had spent decades working with things too valuable for carelessness, were the holdings of a life's work. The shelving on the left wall held cases, perhaps 40 of them, each one roughly the size of a large shoebox, each one made of the same dark metal as the shelves, each one sealed with its own small lock and labeled in a handwriting that was small and precise and practiced. The handwriting of a man who had written in multiple languages, and in each one maintained the same architectural exactness. The labels were in several languages. She could see that even from the distance of first entry. Some in English, some in what she would later identify as Yiddish and Dutch and Polish. Beneath each label, a date. The dates began in the early 1940s and ran through the 1970s. On the right wall, a different kind of storage. Flat drawers, again metal, again labeled, fitted into the shelving like the kind of thing you'd find in a museum's collections management facility. The drawers were sized for flat, wide contents, documents perhaps, or the large folded paper of architectural drawings, or something else entirely that she couldn't name yet. At the far end of the room, centered against the back wall, a workbench. The surface was dark wood, dense and scarred with the particular wear of professional use, a surface that had known thousands of hours of close, precise work. On the workbench, arranged as if their owner had stepped away an hour ago rather than decades, the tools of a diamond cutter. Loops of various magnification in a leather roll, faceting instruments of a kind she didn't have the vocabulary for, but which spoke to skilled, specialized craft. A set of scales, the old balance type, their brass pans tarnished, but intact. A lamp, its cord neatly coiled, connected to nothing because there was nothing to connect it to. and at the center of the workbench, as if placed there intentionally for the person who would eventually find it, a leather-bound ledger. The bioluminescent ceiling strips had reached their full glow now, casting a light that was neither warm nor cold, but something between. A light that existed outside of normal lighting categories, clean and steady and strange. Nora stood up from the floor. She moved to the left wall first, to the numbered cases, and selected one at random. The small lock on each case had a keyhole that matched key 4 on the ring. She pressed key 4 into the lock of the first case she'd chosen. It fit. She turned it. The case opened. Inside, nestled in formed cutouts of aged velvet that had once been deep blue and had faded to the color of an evening sky in winter, were diamonds. Not set diamonds. Not finished jewelry. Unset stones in various sizes and cuts, each one in its own small paper envelope, of the kind she associated with pharmacy dispensing. Each envelope labeled in the same precise handwriting. Each envelope sealed with a small wax stamp that bore the impression of the letter H. She picked up the largest envelope, feeling its weight before she opened it. Substantial. Not heavy the way metal is heavy, but with the particular density of compressed clarity. Saw the weight of something that has been formed by pressure over millions of years, and then shaped by human hands into something that catches light and refuses to let it go. She opened the envelope carefully, tipping its contents into her palm. 3 stones. The largest was perhaps the size of a lentil, cut in a style she didn't know the name for, but which she recognized as old, older than modern cutting standards. The facets fewer and larger, the proportions different from what she'd seen in jewelry store displays. The other 2 were smaller, similarly cut. Even in the bioluminescent light of the sealed room, they gathered what little was available and returned it amplified, fractured into spectrum, the inner fire of diamonds that no imitation could replicate. She stood with 3 diamonds in her palm, in a room she'd unlocked with a key that had been transferred with a property she'd purchased for $10, and the enormity of the moment was too large to process directly. She could only stand at its periphery and let it register in pieces. The cold of the stone room, the faint glow of the ceiling, the weight of the stones in her palm, the silence. She replaced the diamonds carefully, resealed the envelope, placed it back in its formed velvet cutout, closed the case, locked it, moved to another case, opened it. More envelopes, different sizes of stones, all labeled, all organized in that same meticulous system. She counted the cases on the left wall. 42. She looked at the flat drawers on the right wall. She counted those as well. 36 drawers. She looked at the workbench and the ledger. She walked to the workbench and stood before the ledger without touching it for a full minute. The cover was old, soft with age, the leather darkened and supple. A small label on the cover, in that same architectural handwriting. Property of Ezra Hartwell. Private record. Vault inventory and account. She opened it. The pages were cream-colored, dense with the specific yellowing of quality paper that is aged in controlled conditions rather than variable ones. The ink was dark still, not faded. The writing in multiple languages that shifted mid-page sometimes and mid-paragraph others, as if Hartwell had thought in different languages for different kinds of information and let his hand follow his mind without imposing consistency. The first pages were in English, dated 1941. They described, with the economy of language of a man for whom words were expensive, the establishment of what Hartwell called the collection. The word was deliberate, and its meaning was clear in context. He had been a diamond cutter in Antwerp. He had fled in 1938 with his family, ahead of what he could see coming, even when many around him still argued that the worst could not happen. He had brought with him, in addition to his family and his professional tools, the accumulated stones of 20 years of working in the diamond trade, pieces he had held in inventory, pieces he had purchased when they came available at favorable prices, pieces that clients had never returned for, pieces that had passed through his hands and stayed. He had also brought, the ledger made clear in careful factual language, the stones that had been given to him for safekeeping by families who could not carry them, neighbors and colleagues and distant relatives who had pressed packets and envelopes and small parcels into his hands in the months before his departure and asked him to hold them, to carry them, to keep them safe until they came to collect. He had written their names. Each one. Every family. Every person who had given him something. Recorded in the ledger with the stones described and the date received and the value estimated at the time of receipt. He had kept these records with the obsessive exactness of a man who understood that if he did not, no one would, and that the stones were not his, but belonged to people who might someday be able to claim them. He had arrived in Pittsburgh in 1939 with his wife and his 2 daughters, and he had established Hartwell Precision Gem Works in 1921. She'd gotten the date wrong from the history website, which had clearly confused his establishment of the American business with some earlier date in his European career. The factory had operated for nearly 40 years, cutting and polishing diamonds for jewelry manufacturers, building a reputation for quality that had kept the business viable long past the point when the economics would have forced a less skilled operation to close. And throughout those years, the ledger showed he had maintained the vault. Had added to it. Not just the original holdings from Antwerp, which occupied the first and most extensive entries, but new acquisitions, stones purchased when they became available, are proceeds from the factory's most profitable years, converted into physical form, rather than deposited in institutions he did not trust. Diversified holdings in gold leaf and platinum, and other forms he could hold, and see, and know were real. The American section of the ledger, which began around 1945 and ran through the 1970s, showed a systematic mind accumulating slowly and deliberately, adding to the collection with patience and consistency, building what could only be understood as an insurance policy, a hedge against the uncertainty of a world that had already shown him once what certainty was worth. He had written, in one of the English-language entries in the early 1950s, a passage that Nora read 3 times before she could move past it. I have seen what happens when people of good faith trust their wealth to institutions and governments and the structures of civilization. I have seen those structures fail. I have watched neighbors lose everything that paper promised them when the paper became worthless. Gold did not become worthless. Diamonds did not become worthless. The things that human beings have valued across all of recorded civilization continued to hold their value even when the civilization itself was collapsing. I do not know that civilization will collapse again in my lifetime or my children's lifetimes. I hope it will not. But I know that hope is not a financial strategy, and I have placed my family's security in something more reliable than hope. She stood at the workbench in the underground vault of a diamond factory that had been closed for 44 years and read those words and felt them settle into her like weight. Not the weight of stone, not the weight of density and pressure and geological time, but the weight of understanding, the recognition of a mind that had held the same fear she held now, the same terror of falling past the point where falling could be recovered from, and had built something to stand against that fall. She read on. The middle section of the ledger was the most precise, organized like an accountant's record, each item cataloged with date of acquisition, description, purchase price, and assessed value. The assessments were conservative, written in the hand of a man who had worked with gemstones long enough to know their value without needing to inflate it. He had updated the assessments periodically, noting when market conditions had changed, when new appraisal information had become available, when his own sense of a piece's value had shifted with experience. The final entries in the ledger were dated 1974 and 1975. They were in Yiddish primarily, and she would need a translator for most of them. But the final entry, dated October 12, 1975, was in English. She read it in the bioluminescent glow of the room he had built to hold everything he'd protected. She read it with her hands pressing the edges of the ledger and her breath visible in the cold air, and her heart doing something she had no adequate language for. I'm 79 years old, and my wife has been gone for 3 years, and my daughters are established in their lives in other cities. Good lives, lives I am proud of, lives that do not require this vault for their security. I had hoped to give this to them, to tell them what I built and why, but when I tried, they were frightened. They did not want to know. They said it was the past, and they were finished with the past, and I understood. I understood completely, because I am also sometimes finished with the past, but the past is where this collection lives, and I cannot make them take it. I am sealing the entrance to the vault, not because I intend to lose it, but because I am old, and I have no certainty about who will come through these rooms after I am gone, and I want only the person who is meant to find it. I do not know who that person is. I know that they will be someone who looks carefully, someone who does not accept the surface of things, someone who asks the question that is harder to ask, the one that requires more patience and more courage. What is behind this wall? What is in this room? What was worth protecting enough that someone built a vault for it in the bedrock of a city? If you are reading this, you found the answer. The collection belongs to you now. Whatever you do with it, do it with the understanding of what it cost the people who assembled it. Some of these stones came to me from families who did not survive to claim them. I have tried all my life to honor that trust by keeping them safe. I leave that obligation to you. Keep them safe. Use them to build something. Honor the people who could not be here to use them themselves. That is all I ask. There is no legal mechanism I can create that will compel you to honor this request. I am trusting the character of whoever finds this to be sufficient. I hope I am right. Ezra Hartwell, October 12, 1975. He had died, the history website had noted, in 1976. He had written this 11 months before his death, sealed the vault, walked up the corridor, built the brick wall over the entrance himself, or with the help of a trusted few, and gone to meet his end, knowing that whatever came next was out of his hands. She closed the ledger. She held it against her chest for a moment with both arms. Then she set it back exactly where she'd found it, at the center of the workbench, in the position of a thing placed with intention. She walked back through the vault slowly, running her flashlight along the shelving, the cases, the drawers. She did not open anything else. She had enough. She had more than enough. She went back through the vault door, pulled it closed behind her, heard the mechanism re-engage as the weight of the door settled into its frame. She walked the corridor in the dark. She climbed back through the opening in the brick wall. She sat on the tile floor of the foreman's office with the key ring in her hands and the brick pile behind her and the dust mask around her chin, and she did not move for a long time. When she finally moved, she took out her phone and called her mother. Graciela answered on the second ring. "You found something," her mother said, before Nora had said anything. "How did you know?" "Because you're calling in the middle of the day. Because your breathing sounds like the way your father's used to sound when he was trying to be steady and was not entirely succeeding." Nora looked at the brick she'd removed from the wall, stacked carefully on the tile. "Mama," she said, "I need you to tell me something honestly." "Okay. What would you do if something enormous happened? Something that changed everything. The kind of thing that you don't have a framework for because you've never been anywhere close to it before. Graziella was quiet for a moment. Is anyone hurt? No. Is anyone in danger? No. Is it something illegal? No, definitely no. Her mother's quiet filled the phone for another moment. Then Graziella said, I would call the person I trust most, and I would not be alone with it. Nora looked around the foreman's office, the handless clock, the hexagonal tile, the opening she'd made in the wall. Yes, she said. That's what I'm doing. Patricia Okafor came the next morning. Nora had called her the previous evening and described precisely and completely what she'd found. Patricia had listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Then Patricia said, I'm going to need to see this before I say anything useful. What time works for you? They went in together, Nora leading the way through the main entrance, through the production floor, through the east corridor, into the foreman's office. Patricia stood at the brick opening Nora had made and shone her own flashlight down the corridor toward the vault door. She was quiet for a long time. Then she turned to look at Nora. Don, you closed it behind you when you left. Yes. Key 3. Patricia nodded. I'd like to see it. She climbed through the opening with the ease of someone who had been in confined construction spaces for 30 years. Nora followed. They walked the corridor together. At the vault door, Patricia ran her hands over the surface, the way she'd run her hands over the brick facing above, professional and methodical, and reading through touch what her eyes couldn't tell her. She examined the locking mechanism, the hinges, the seal where door met frame. This was built by a specialist, she said. The metalwork on this door was not done locally. This is European work. Antwerp or Amsterdam, my guess, based on the style of the mechanism. This kind of vault door was common in European diamond trading houses in the 1920s and 1930s. I've seen them in photographs, but never in person. Nora used key 3. The mechanism performed the same as the day before, the deep resonant click, the counterclockwise turn of the wheel, the bolts retracting one after another. The door swung open. Patricia stepped through and stood in the vault, while the bioluminescent ceiling strips activated and the room filled with their cold, clean light. The engineer was not a woman who showed her reactions freely. She had the professional composure of someone who had trained herself not to let surprise or emotion affect her assessment. She moved through the vault with measured steps, looking at the shelving, the cases, the flat drawers, the workbench. She picked up nothing. She looked at everything. At the workbench, she stood before Hartwell's ledger for a moment without touching it. Then she turned to look at Nora. You understand what this is? Yes. You understand that the legal situation here is complex? Yes. Patricia looked at the ceiling, the bioluminescent strips still glowing steadily. This preservation system is extraordinary, she said. The atmospheric seal on this room is still functioning after 50 years. The humidity level in here is consistent with professional gem storage requirements. He didn't just seal this room. He engineered it to remain viable indefinitely. She looked back at Nora. You're going to need a lawyer. Today, ideally. You're going to need a gemologist, a historian, potentially a Holocaust restitution specialist, given what you've described about the provenance of some of the stones. And you need all of this before you open a single additional case or remove a single item from this room. Nora said, I know. Patricia said, this is going to change your life. Nora looked at the room around her, the organized shelving, the locked cases, the workbench where Ezra Hartwell had spent thousands of hours in patient, skilled work. The ledger he had left as a trust document for someone he would never meet. I know that too, she said. The lawyer she found was named Samuel Park, a property and estate attorney in Pittsburgh, who had handled several unusual inheritance cases, and who came recommended by a legal aid organization that Nora had called first, uncertain whether she could afford professional counsel and unwilling to proceed without it. Samuel Park had heard her out over the phone, asking the kind of questions that told her he was doing it right. Not just building toward a predetermined conclusion, but actually trying to understand what had happened. He agreed to an initial consultation at a reduced rate, which she paid. He told her, at the end of that consultation, that her situation was legally unusual, but not legally unclear. "You purchased the property legally through a legitimate government auction," he said. "The property deed covers the land and all structures and improvements thereon. The vault and its contents are improvements thereon. They were present when the property transferred and therefore transferred with it. The question of whether the previous owner, in this case the city, knew about the vault is relevant to whether the transfer can be contested, but the city had held the property since 1994. If there were contents of significant value in the structure, it was the city's responsibility to assess them before auction. They chose not to. That is not your problem." He paused. "There's a more complicated question related to provenance. Some of the contents of this vault, based on what you've described and what I can see from the entries you photographed in the ledger, may have been entrusted to Hartwell by individuals who were subsequently murdered in the Holocaust. Their living descendants, if any exist, may have claims. This is a matter of Holocaust restitution law, which is a specialized area. I can work with specialists in this field, but I want you to understand from the beginning that if families can be found who have legitimate claims to specific stones, the morally and legally correct action is to return those stones." Nora said, "I know. That's what Hartwell asked for, and that's what I intend to do." Park looked at her over his desk for a moment. Most people in your situation would not say that as their first response. Nora said, "I've read his ledger. I understand what he was trying to protect. I'm not going to use someone else's family's inheritance to pay my rent. That's not what this is." Samuel Park nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Then let's get started." The authentication process took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Nora continued working at the coffee shop, continued sleeping on her mother's couch, continued keeping Marco and Rosa unaware of the specifics of what was happening in the factory she'd bought, and she told them only that she was working on the building and that it was taking time and that patience was necessary, and they accepted this with the resilience of children who had learned that things took time and that their mother did not say things were fine when they weren't. The gemologist Park hired was Dr. Miriam Schatz, a woman with 40 years of experience in gem assessment who worked primarily with auction houses and insurance companies and held a research position at Carnegie Mellon. She entered the vault on a Tuesday morning with 3 assistants and equipment that would have seemed incongruous in the underground stone room if Nora had not been present for enough assessment processes in her professional life to recognize systematic work regardless of context. Dr. Schatz opened the cases one by one, examined each stone, weighed each stone, photographed each stone, consulted the ledger entries for each stone, comparing Hartwell's descriptions and assessments with her own findings. She was meticulous and unhurried, and occasionally, when she opened a case and found something that exceeded even her professional expectations, she permitted herself a small sound that was not quite language, but communicated clearly enough. On the second day, she called Nora into the vault at the end of the assessment session and stood in the center of the room with her notebook. "There are things I'm going to tell you now that will seem impossible to believe," she said. "I want you to understand that what I'm describing is based on my professional assessment, which I will document fully and which will be supported by the assessments of the additional specialists Samuel Park is bringing in for confirmation." Nora said. "Tell me." "The collection, as I understand it, after 2 days of examination," Dr. Schatz began, "comprises 4 categories. The first is the original Antwerp holdings that Hartwell brought with him when he fled, approximately 65 stones of various cuts and sizes, the majority of which are Old European cut diamonds, the predominant style of the early 20th century, in weights ranging from 3/4 of a carat to the largest stone I've assessed so far, which is 11.3 carats and is of a quality that I would characterize as exceptional. The Old European cut stones in this collection are historically significant, not just for their individual value, but for their provenance, for what they represent about the pre-war diamond trade in Antwerp, and for their condition after more than 80 years in this vault, which has preserved them perfectly. The second category is the trust holdings, the stones given to Hartwell by families before and during the early years of the war. These are documented in the ledger in considerable detail, and we will need to work through each one against historical records to identify potential living heirs. Based on what I can see so far, this portion of the collection represents perhaps 30% of the stones. The third category is the American acquisitions, the stones Hartwell purchased during his years of operation here. These range considerably in quality and character, and include some exceptional pieces, particularly in the colored diamond category. He had 2 natural fancy yellow diamonds and 1 natural pink diamond that I would describe conservatively as extraordinary. The pink stone is approximately 7 carats, and I have not personally handled a stone of this combination of size and quality outside of major auction house contexts. She paused. The fourth category is the non-diamond holdings: gold, platinum, historical currency, bearer bonds from institutions that Hartwell did not trust. Some of these may or may not be of current value. Samuel Park's team will need to work through them, but the diamonds alone are sufficient to make the overall assessment remarkable. Nora said, "What is the overall assessment?" Dr. Schatz looked at her notepad, and then back at Nora. "I want to give you a range rather than a specific figure because the actual realized values will depend on auction conditions, market timing, the outcome of restitution processes for the trust holdings, and various other factors. But on a conservative basis, based on current market conditions and the quality of what I've assessed so far, the diamond portion of this collection would bring at auction somewhere between $280 and $330 million. Nora sat down on the floor again. This time, she did it consciously, deliberate, choosing the floor because it was solid in a way that nothing else currently was. $330 million. $330 million in stones that had been locked in a vault under a condemned diamond factory in Braddock, Pennsylvania, sealed behind a brick wall by a man who had fled genocide and built something that was meant to survive everything, and had, in fact, survived everything, had survived the death of the man who built it, and the closing of the factory above it, and 45 years of abandoned accumulating silence, had survived until a woman who had nowhere else to go bought the property for $10 because she needed an address. She sat on the cold stone floor of the vault that Ezra Hartwell had built and looked at the cases on the shelves and the drawers on the opposite wall, and the workbench with the ledger and the tools arranged as if their owner had just stepped out. And she let the number exist in her mind without trying to make it smaller or more manageable or more like something she could hold without being changed by. $330 million. Some of it, not hers. She sat with that too. Some of these stones had been pressed into Hartwell's hands by people going to their deaths. Some of them were the last thing those families had been able to do for the children and grandchildren who might survive. Those stones had names on them in the ledger, names that belonged to families who might have living descendants, people who did not know this vault existed, who might have spent 80 years without knowing that someone had tried to keep something safe for them. Nora thought about her mother's apartment, the couch, the children sleeping on the blow-up mattress, the coffee shop uniform by the door. She thought about the eviction notice and the severance and the 53 applications that had gone into an electronic void. She thought about Marco saying, "This one's got good bones," standing on the sidewalk in the cold with the kind of faith in his mother that she didn't know yet whether she deserved. She thought about Ezra Hartwell, who had fled with everything he could carry and spent 30 years building a vault in bedrock and then sealed it with his own hands and trusted it to whoever came next. She thought about what he had written. Use them to build something. Honor the people who could not be here to use them themselves. That is all I ask. She got up off the floor. She brushed off the back of her coat. She looked at Dr. Schatz, who had been waiting with professional patience for Nora to complete whatever internal process the number had initiated. "What is the next step?" Nora asked. Dr. Schatz said, "We finish the assessment. Then we work with Park and the restitution specialists to identify any families who have claims. Then you decide what you want to do with the rest." And she said it again, the thing she'd said about the couch and the children and the address and the $10 and the key ring and the building with good bones. Nora said, "I know what I want to do." The news did not break, the way news breaks in movies, all at once, in a single moment, with cameras and headlines, and the world rearranging itself around the revelation. It broke the way real things break, slowly, in pieces, through the ordinary channels of human communication, one conversation at a time. Samuel Park filed the property documentation and the vault inventory with the county recorder's office in early December. This was required. This was the law, and Nora had decided from the beginning that she was going to do everything by the law. Every step, every filing, every disclosure. Because the one thing she could control in a situation that had been entirely outside her control from the beginning was how she conducted herself through it. The filing was a public record. A local journalist named Christine Vo, who covered real estate and development for a Pittsburgh online news outlet and who had a habit of scanning public filings for unusual items, found it 6 days after Park submitted it. She called Nora's number, which was listed on the property deed. Nora answered on the third ring, standing in her mother's kitchen, and listened to Christine Vo describe what she'd found in the public record, and said, "Yes, that's accurate." Christine Vo said, "Can I ask you a few questions?" Nora said, "Not yet. I'll call you when we're ready." Christine Vo, who was a good journalist, said, "Can I ask you to call me before you call anyone else?" Nora said, "Yes, I can do that." She called Samuel Park immediately after. He was not surprised. He'd warned her that the filing would be visible. He had a media strategy prepared and he walked her through it. The sequence of disclosures, the key messages, the one thing she was not going to say until the restitution process was further along, which was the specific monetary value of the collection. "We don't confirm numbers until we've completed the restitution assessment," Park said, "partly for legal reasons and partly because the first story I want told about this is not the money. The first story I want told is about what Hartwell built and why." Nora said, "That's the story I want told too." The story ran on a Thursday, 10 days before Christmas. Christine Vo had done the work that good journalists do, had spoken to historians at Pitt and Carnegie Mellon, had found archival references to the Hartwell factory, had located a photograph of Ezra Hartwell from a 1951 community newspaper that showed a slight man in a suit with the kind of careful, watchful eyes that belonging to someone who had learned to read rooms. The photograph ran alongside the article. The headline was, "Pittsburgh woman buys condemned factory for $10, discovers century-old diamond vault. The article was careful, it was precise. It quoted Nora briefly, and quoted Park at more length, and quoted Dr. Unschatz on the historical significance of the collection, and it said nothing about specific monetary values, only that the collection was of considerable historical and financial significance and was undergoing full professional assessment. It included, near the end, the passage from Hartwell's ledger that Nora had shared with Christine Vaux, because she'd felt it was the heart of the story, and the story couldn't be told honestly without it. I am trusting the character of whoever finds this to be sufficient. I hope I am right. Christine Vaux had written, in the paragraph preceding the quote, Nora Castillo, 36, a former pharmaceutical quality control supervisor who purchased the condemned factory as part of an effort to find stable housing for herself and her 2 children. She said she read that passage and understood immediately what was required of her. By the end of that Thursday, the article had been shared 40,000 times. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by the Associated Press and was running in newspapers in 14 states. By Friday afternoon, 3 national television producers had called Samuel Park's office requesting interviews. Nora spent Friday at her mother's kitchen table with her phone face down, letting the calls go to voicemail, drinking coffee, and watching Marco do his robotics homework with an intensity that reminded her of herself. He didn't know yet. Rosa didn't know yet. Her mother knew, of course. Had known since the day Nora called her from the foreman's office floor, and had been holding the knowledge with the particular dignity that Graciela Castillo applied to all large things, treating it as something that required patience before it was fully real. That evening, Nora told her children. She sat them at the kitchen table after dinner with the article on her phone and let them read it. Rosa read slowly, her lips moving slightly, the way she did when the material was important enough to require full attention. Marco read fast, then read again. When they'd both finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Rosa looked up with an expression of complete bewilderment that would have been funny in other circumstances. We own a diamond factory? Not exactly. We own a building that has a vault in it, a vault with diamonds, from 1941. That's before Grandma was born. Yes, Marco was looking at the photograph of Ezra Hartwell. This man hid them? He protected them. There's a difference. Marco studied the photograph. How old was he when he built the vault? Nora thought. He came to Pittsburgh in 1939. He was probably in his early 40s. So he spent like 30 years filling it up. Something like that. Yes. And then he sealed it. And then he trusted whoever found it to do the right thing. Marco looked up at her. That's us. That's a lot of trust for someone you've never met, and who might not even be born yet. Nora looked at her son. That's what makes it trust, she said. It's not trust if you know the outcome. Marco nodded slowly, processing this in the way he processed things that required more than one pass. Then he said, Mama, what are we going to do with $300 million? Nora looked at him steadily. We're going to do what he asked us to do. We're going to find the families of the people whose stones he was keeping. And we're going to build something. Marco thought about this. Then he said, with the practicality of a child who had been paying close attention to his family's circumstances for the past several months, can we build it somewhere warm? Despite everything, she laughed. The calls from Dennis Hartwick at the City Property Management Office came on Monday morning. He left a message that was carefully professional and entirely unable to conceal the fact that a man who had transferred many distressed properties had just processed the information that one of those properties contained $300 million in diamonds and had been sold for $10. She called him back. Mr. Hartwick. Ms. Castillo. His voice was the voice of a man choosing words with great care. I wanted to reach out regarding the recent news coverage. Yes, I wanted to say, first, congratulations. Thank you. And second, I wanted to say that the city has no legal basis for any claim on the vault contents. Park had already confirmed this, had made it explicitly clear in his filings. Nora said, I know. I have a very good lawyer. Mr. Hartwick said, yes. So I'm told. There was a pause. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something else. Then he said, I told you the building had something. I remember. Something worth protecting. I believe that was the phrase. She heard him exhale. I've been doing this job for 22 years, and I have never. He stopped. He started again. I want you to know that I'm glad it went to someone who read the building the way you did. It could have stayed in that auction catalog forever. No one else was bidding. No one else thought it was worth a second look. Nora thought about the night she'd clicked confirm bid at 12:47 in the morning on her mother's couch with $600 in her account and nowhere to take her children. Sometimes the only bid is the right bid, she said. Hartwick laughed, a short, genuine sound. Yes, he said. Sometimes it is. Good luck, Miss Castillo. I think you've already earned it, but good luck all the same. The harder conversation came from a different direction. Her former manager at Meridian, and a man named Greg Ferris, who had shaken her hand on that Tuesday afternoon with the severance check and the suggestion that she shouldn't have trouble finding something else with her experience, called her on a Wednesday. He'd seen the coverage. His voice had the particular quality of someone making a call they'd been considering for several days. Nora, he said. Hey, this is Greg. Greg Ferris from Meridian. I know who you are, Greg. Right. He cleared his throat. I'm calling to say that I saw the news, and I wanted to say congratulations. That's amazing what you found. Nora waited. Greg filled the silence with the sound of a man who had more to say and was trying to find the formulation. I also wanted to say that I always thought you were one of the best we had on the floor. The decision to close the Pittsburgh operations was made above my level. I want you to know that if it had been my call, you would have been the last person I let go. She thought about the 12 applications she'd put in at Meridian's competitor plants after the layoff. None of them had called back. She knew Greg Ferris had contacts at several of those facilities. She thought about asking him whether he'd said anything when her name had come up, whether the handshake that felt like a slap had been the entirety of his investment in what happened to her next. She thought about it and decided it wasn't the conversation she wanted to have. Greg, she said, I appreciate the call. Take care of yourself. And she ended it. Her cousin Diane came to the apartment in person, which Nora had expected. Diane brought food, which was her response to every kind of crisis, and sat at Graciela's kitchen table across from Nora, with a container of rice and beans between them, and her hands folded on the table in the posture of a woman preparing to be honest. I owe you an apology, Diane said. Nora looked at her. That building is on the news every other year because kids get hurt in it, Nora said. That's what you said. Yes, Diane met her eyes. And I was right about the building being dangerous and wrong about everything else that mattered. I looked at a condemned factory and saw a condemned factory. You looked at the same building and saw something worth looking inside. That's the difference between us that I've been turning over in my head for 3 weeks. Nora said, You were being practical. I was being desperate. And sometimes desperate and right end up in the same place. Diane looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Can I ask you something honestly? Ask. When you placed that bid, when you were sitting on your mother's couch at 1 in the morning with $600, did you know? Nora considered the question seriously, because it deserved serious consideration. No, she said. I didn't know anything, except that I needed to do something, and this was something I could do. I felt like the building was worth more than it looked, but I didn't know. All I knew was that not doing it felt worse than doing it. Diane nodded slowly. That's what I've been trying to understand, how you got from not knowing to doing it anyway. Nora looked at the rice and beans on the table. The food Diane always brought when things were hard, because it was her mother's recipe and her grandmother's before that, the thing her family made when someone needed something solid. You just do, Nora said, when the only option that moves you forward is the one that also scares you the most. You just do it. You pick up the chisel and you start hitting the wall. Diane said, I'm putting that on a refrigerator magnet. Nora laughed, and they ate, and it was the first easy evening she'd had in months. The restitution process was the work that mattered most and the work that took the longest. Samuel Park brought in a specialist named Dr. Ruth Eisenberg from the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, an organization that had spent decades doing exactly the kind of archival detective work that Hartwell's ledger required. Dr. Eisenberg arrived in Pittsburgh in January, a compact woman in her late 60s, with the energetic precision of someone for whom this work was not a job, but a calling. She spent 2 weeks in the vault with the ledger and her own extensive databases of pre-war Jewish family records, diamond merchant registries from the Antwerp trade, deportation records, survivor testimonies. The names in Hartwell's ledger, the families who had pressed envelopes into his hands in those last terrible years before the worst happened, were not easy to trace. The records were incomplete by design and by disaster, incomplete because bureaucracies of extermination kept records of different things than records of survival, was incomplete because families had scattered and changed names and built new lives in new countries without always preserving the connections to what had been before. But some could be found. Across 3 months of research that Dr. Eisenberg conducted from Pittsburgh and from her offices in London and from archives in Amsterdam and Warsaw and Israel, 17 families were identified with reasonable confidence as having living descendants connected to the stones in Hartwell's trust holdings. They were people living in Tel Aviv and New York and Montreal and Melbourne and London and São Paulo. They ranged in age from their 30s to their 80s. Most of them had known nothing about the stones. Most of them had known nothing about Ezra Hartwell or what he had carried across an ocean on behalf of people he had been helpless to carry. The notifications were handled carefully through lawyers and through Dr. Eisenberg's organization, with full documentation of the provenance and the assessment and the legal basis for the claim. Nora received, through Samuel Park, 7 responses in the first month. Some from families who were overwhelmed and needed time. Some from families who asked questions that needed careful, thorough answers. 2 from families who, after understanding what the stones represented and what had happened to the people from whom they came, asked that the stones be donated to Holocaust memorial institutions rather than sold, a wish Nora honored immediately and completely. One response came directly, bypassing lawyers entirely, from an 81-year-old woman named Adela Weiss, living in a retirement community outside Tel Aviv, who had been 4 years old when her mother had put something into Ezra Hartwell's hands in Antwerp in 1938. Adela had been told, decades later, by a relative who'd survived, that her mother had given a diamond cutter named Hartwell some of the family's stones for safekeeping. She had spent years trying to find what had happened to them, had filed claims with multiple restitution organizations, had followed dead ends in the records until she'd finally concluded, in her 70s, that the stones were gone and the trail was cold, and she needed to make peace with not knowing. She had not made peace with not knowing. She had simply stopped looking. Her letter to Nora, which arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, was written in English in the careful, informal phrasing of someone whose first language was something else, but who had command of the foreign tongue. It said, "I do not know how to write this letter. I have been trying to write it for 3 weeks since Dr. Eisenberg called me. I want to say thank you, but those words are not large enough for what I want to say. My mother gave those stones to a man she trusted because she believed he was honest and would hold them safely. She was right. She was murdered in 1942 in Sobibor. I was taken out of Antwerp by a family who hid me, and later I was adopted, and later I was this whole life that I have had. But I never stopped thinking about my mother trusting that man, wondering if the trust was honored, wondering what happened to what she gave him. You are the answer to what happened. A woman I have never met, in a city I have never been to, my buying a building for $10 and finding what my mother trusted to a man who was also honest. I am not religious. I stopped being religious when I was young. But I believe there are things that happen that we do not have an adequate word for, except that they were supposed to happen. You finding that vault was supposed to happen. Please know that whatever you do with what you found, you have already given me the thing I needed most, which is to know that my mother's trust was honored, that the man she gave the stones to was what she believed he was, and that the person who found them was what he hoped they would be. Nora read the letter 4 times. Then she asked Dr. Eisenberg to ask Adela Weiss whether she would be willing to speak by video call. Adela Weiss said yes. They spoke for 90 minutes on a Sunday afternoon, with Graziella sitting off to one side because Nora had not wanted to be alone for this conversation. Adela was small on the screen, white-haired, with her mother's eyes by her own account, the eyes from the one photograph that had survived. They spoke about Hartwell, and about the vault, and about what it had held, and what it meant. They spoke about Adela's mother, and about the particular quality of trust that a woman extends when she is out of options, and the only thing left to do is believe in someone else's honesty. At the end of the call, Adela said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Yes." "What will you do with the rest? The part that is yours?" Nora looked at the camera. "I'm going to build something," she said. "Something that lasts. Something that other people can find when they have no other options." Adela looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said. "That is what he would have wanted. That is what my mother would have wanted. That is what you should do." By the time the full assessment was complete and the restitution process had resolved as much as it could be resolved, the final accounting was this. Of the total collection, the trust holdings attributed to families in the ledger amounted to roughly 22% of the diamond value. Of those, the descendants of 11 families were identified and contacted, and the corresponding stones were returned, or, at the family's direction, donated to memorial institutions. 6 families could not be traced with sufficient confidence, and the stones from their holdings were, at Nora's direction and in consultation with Dr. Eisenberg and Dr. Schatz, donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, which established a permanent display case for the Hartwell collection with the names of the families listed on the placard. 3 cases from the collection were donated to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, where they were displayed in a permanent exhibit about the history of the diamond trade that included the story of Ezra Hartwell and his factory, and the woman who had bought the factory for $10 and found what he'd left behind. The remaining collection, Hartwell's own holdings, and the American acquisitions, and the financial instruments, was handled through a series of carefully structured auctions over the following 18 months, working with Sotheby's and Christie's and Bonhams and specialized dealers for the rarer pieces. The pink diamond was auctioned at Sotheby's Geneva on a Thursday evening in October and sold for $31 million to a private buyer, a result that Dr. Schatz had predicted could happen, and that still, when the hammer came down and Samuel Park called Nora from Geneva, made her sit down and press her hand against the wall next to the phone. The 11.3 carat old European cut stone, the largest single diamond in the collection, sold at Christie's, New York for $18 million. The total realized from Nora's portion of the collection, after taxes, after legal fees, after the costs of the restitution process and the assessment and the auctions, was $208 million. $208 million in a bank account with her name on it. A number so far outside her previous experience that she had no emotional register for it, had to approach it sideways and in pieces, had to deliberately assign it to the category of tool rather than destination, or it would have been paralyzing instead of enabling. It was not the point. The point was what came next. The thing she built first was the most personal. She bought the Hartwell building, not the vault, which she already owned, but the building above it, which she had been technically occupying during the months of the assessment, and which she now purchased from herself for the purposes of the renovation, engaging Patricia Okafor as the supervising structural engineer and a Pittsburgh architectural firm to handle the design work. So she told them what she wanted, not luxury, not a monument to herself or to the discovery. She wanted the building to be useful. She wanted it to house people who needed housing. The renovation took 14 months. The north wing, where the roof had collapsed, was rebuilt from the foundation according to new construction standards. The main production floor, that vast space with the 20-foot ceilings and the steel beam infrastructure, was converted into a community hall, an open, adaptable space with the original brick and concrete preserved and a new roof above it that let in northern light through a clear story that Patricia Okafor had designed with particular care. The upper floors were converted into 48 residential units, ranging from studios to 3 bedrooms, but each one finished to a standard that was clean and dignified and not austere, each one with windows that looked out over Braddock and the Monongahela Valley and the Edgar Thomson plant with its towers and its orange night sky. The rents were set at 30% below market rate and prioritized for families in demonstrated need. There was a waiting list before the building was finished being renovated. The community hall on the ground floor became the home of several programs that Nora established in the first year. A job training program for people who'd been laid off or displaced from industrial work, the population she knew best, people who had the discipline and the physical intelligence that manufacturing required, and who needed help translating that into employable skills in an economy that kept shifting what it needed. A childcare cooperative that operated on a sliding scale, staffed by trained professionals, but supplemented by a parent participation model that reduced costs and built community. A library and digital access center in the old foreman's office, which had been restored with its hexagonal tile floor intact and its windows unsealed. Light now coming through the original panes that someone had sourced from a restoration specialist because Nora had insisted the room keep its original character. The handless clock on the wall of the foreman's office had been restored, its hands replaced, set to the correct time, ticking again in the room where Nora had first noticed that 12 feet were missing, and that sometimes the most important question is the one you have to be desperate enough to ask. The vault was sealed again, not permanently, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. The door remained accessible, the vault intact, the workbench with Hartwell's tools still arranged as he'd left them. Twice a year, the building hosted tours for school groups from Pittsburgh and the surrounding area, led by a historian whom Nora had hired specifically for this purpose, a young man named James Wolfe, who had written his doctoral dissertation on Holocaust restitution and who understood that the history of this place was not finished, that it was still accumulating, that every family that had received what Hartwell protected, and every family that had moved into the building above, and every child that had learned something in the community hall was part of what this building now meant. The foundation Nora established was called the Hartwell Foundation, not named for herself, not named for the discovery, named for the man whose careful, frightened, courageous, patient work had made everything possible. Its mission statement, written by Nora herself in a process that took 3 weeks and 17 drafts, read, "The Hartwell Foundation exists to do what Ezra Hartwell did, to protect what is worth protecting, to hold in trust what cannot yet be claimed, to build structures that outlast individual lives and serve the people who come after, to treat the resources of the present as an obligation to the future." Marco, who was 13 when the Foundation's work began in earnest, had opinions about the mission statement. He said it was too long and should be condensed. Nora said, "Tell me what you'd cut." He read it again. "Nothing," he said eventually. "I'd cut nothing. It all needs to be there." And she ruffled his hair, and he pretended to object, which was a performance they both enjoyed. Rosa, who was 10, said the mission statement was beautiful, and then asked whether the Foundation could also do something about the fact that her school's library had almost no books. The Foundation's third program was a school library initiative in Braddock and 3 neighboring districts. It was funded at a level that meant every school had what its students needed, and Rosa had been consulted about the selection criteria for the initial collections, because Nora believed in asking the people who would use something what they actually needed, rather than deciding on their behalf. The press did not leave her alone immediately or easily. There was a period of months in which she was the story, in which her phone rang constantly, and her inbox was full, and people wanted to write about her, and interview her, and make documentaries about her. And she managed this the way she managed every other system she'd ever worked with, by identifying the structure underneath the chaos and operating according to that structure, rather than being operated on by the chaos. She agreed to 2 interviews in the first year, one with Christine Vaux, who had broken the story and who had been honest in her journalism, and who Nora felt deserved the follow-up she'd earned. Christine wrote a long piece about the Foundation and the renovation and the restitution work that ran in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on the first anniversary of the auction bid, and that won a regional journalism award and deserved to. Said the second interview was with a documentary filmmaker who was making a film about Holocaust restitution, not about Nora specifically, but about the broader process by which objects separated from their owners by genocide found their way back, sometimes generations later, through the intersection of historical research and human persistence. Nora appeared briefly in the film. Adela Weiss appeared longer. The film included the photograph of Hartwell from the 1951 community newspaper, his careful, watchful eyes looking out of a past that had become the foundation of a present he couldn't have imagined. The rest of the requests she declined, politely and consistently, because she had made a decision early on that she was not the story. The vault was not the story. The money was not the story. The story was what you did with what you found, and the doing was visible enough in the building, and the programs, and the families who had moved into apartments that were clean and dignified, and not the back seat of a car. Patricia Okafor came by the building on a Tuesday afternoon in October, about 18 months after the renovation was complete. She walked through the community hall, stopped in the foreman's office to look at the hexagonal tile and the restored clock, ran her hand along the brick of the interior wall, the wall Nora had opened and carefully rebuilt during the renovation so that it was sound and honest, and you could see where the new work joined the old, if you knew to look. Nora found her there in the foreman's office, doing what structural engineers do, reading a building through touch and attention. Patricia looked up. "You kept the join visible," she said, almost touching the mortar line where old brick met new. Yes. Why? Nora thought about how to answer this. Because I didn't want to pretend the wall was always what it is now, she said. Because the opening was part of what the building is. You shouldn't cover up the part of the story that mattered. Patricia nodded, running her hand one more time along the join. Then she looked at Nora with the same directness she'd had in the first assessment, the first day she'd walked through this building, and said it had a density, a weight, the quality of something built by someone who believed what was inside it was worth protecting. You did the right thing, she said. Not just the legal thing, the right thing. Nora said, I had a good example. Graziella turned 65 the following spring, and Nora threw her a party in the community hall that her mother initially protested was too much and subsequently conceded was exactly right. The hall was full of people, the women from the card club and the cousins and the neighbors from Munhall, who had known Graziella for 40 years, and Diane, who arrived with food as always, and Marco's robotics team, which he'd rejoined and which had placed second at a regional competition that fall, and Rosa's piano teacher, who had become a friend of the family in the way that music teachers sometimes do when a student is serious about the work, and Patricia Okafor and her husband, and Samuel Park and his partner, and Christine Vaux and her daughter, and James Wolfe, who ran the historical programs in the vault, and some Miriam Schatz, who still called occasionally to tell Nora about diamonds she encountered in her work that reminded her of something from the collection, and a handful of families who had moved into the building's residential units and who had become, in the way of neighbors who share a building with an unusual history, people that Nora knew and watched out for and was watched out for, by in return. Nora stood at the edge of the party at one point and looked at the community hall, the high ceiling and the northern light and the original brick walls with the marks of a century of use still visible in them, and the room full of people who were laughing and talking and eating Diane's food, and Rosa was at the upright piano in the corner, playing something she'd been working on for weeks, and Marco was explaining something to a group of adults who were listening with more attention than adults usually give 11-year-old engineers. Her mother was at the center of everything, the way she always was, the way she had always been, the fixed point around which everything in Nora's life had orbited, the woman who had opened her door without complaint and held the weight of knowledge and said, "Go look at your diamond factory," in a tone that made it sound both practical and inevitable. Graziella found her at the edge of the room. "You're doing that thing," her mother said. "What thing?" "The thing where you try to memorize everything, in case it goes away." Aunt Nora looked at her. "Is that what I'm doing?" "That's what you've been doing since you were 7 years old. The first time you had something you were afraid of losing." Nora thought about this. The couch, the parking lots, the Civic with the heater that had its own ideas about when to function, the $600, the $10 bid at 12:47 in the morning. She thought about the corridor and the vault door and the key that fit. She thought about Ezra Hartwell, who had been afraid of losing everything and had built something so it would still be there when it was needed, and who had been right, who had been absolutely right, who had been so right that 80 years later, a woman with nowhere to go had found what he built and understood what it meant and tried to do what it required. "You don't have to memorize it," her mother said. "It's yours. It's not going anywhere." "I know," Nora said. "I'm just still surprised sometimes that it's real." Graziella put her hand on her daughter's arm. "That feeling," she said, "doesn't go away. The feeling that something real is too good to be real. But you learn to trust it. You learn that the things you built are solid. You learn to stand on them." Nora looked at her mother. Then she looked at the room, the community hall in the building she had bought for $10 because she'd needed an address, and had found instead a vault built by a man who had needed the world to be worth trusting. Marco caught her eye from across the room and gave her the look he'd given her on the sidewalk in November, standing in front of the building with the collapsed roof and the rusted barbed wire, and the sign that said, "Hazardous structure, keep out." The look that said, "This one has good bones." She gave him back the same look. He turned back to his explanation, and she turned back to the party, and somewhere under the floor of the building, in the stone vault, with the bioluminescent ceiling strips and the workbench and the ledger, the key that Ezra Hartwell had cut for a lock he'd built for something he believed was worth protecting, was exactly where it had always been. Patient and solid and present, waiting for whatever came next. There are people who look at things as they appear, and people who ask what is underneath. Nora Castillo was always the second kind, even when it cost her, even when looking underneath a surface meant finding something harder than the surface, for even when the gap between floor plan and actual room required a cold chisel and 2 hours of careful work before it gave up its answer. On the night she had placed a $10 bid on a condemned building because she had nowhere else to go, she had not known what was there. She had only known that something was, that the building held more than it showed, that whoever had built it for a reason, and that the reason was still present in the mortar, and the stone, and the vault door, and the ledger, and the careful handwriting of a man who had survived the unsurvivable and built something in the bedrock of an American city that would outlast his fear and his loneliness and his death. The thing he built was waiting for someone who would not give up. It waited for 45 years. It waited through the closing of the factory and the transfer of the property and the 5 successive owners who had walked away, and the city that had held it without looking, and the auction listing that sat at $10 for 6 hours in the middle of the night with no competing bids. It waited until the right person came along, not the richest person, not the most qualified, not the one with the best plan or the clearest vision, just the one who was desperate enough to act, and careful enough to look, and stubborn enough to keep looking after looking. Once was not enough. The one who, on a frozen November morning with a dust mask and a borrowed wrecking bar and a floor plan that was 12 feet wrong, decided that the wall was worth opening because something on the other side was worth knowing. That is what this story is about, and not the diamonds, not the $300 million, or the auction hammer coming down, or the pink diamond under the lights at Sotheby's Geneva. Not even the vault itself, extraordinary as it was, built with care by a man who understood better than most what it meant to lose everything. This story is about the act of looking, the decision to ask the question that is harder to ask, the willingness to hit the wall when everything about your circumstances is telling you that you don't have the strength for it. Nora Castillo hit the wall. She found what was behind it, and then she did what Ezra Hartwell had hoped for and could not know for certain, and had trusted to chance and character and the patience of stone. She used it well. There was a moment, about 4 months after the story ran nationally, and 3 months after the first auction results came in, when Nora drove back to Swissvale. She hadn't planned to. She'd been running errands, picking up supplies for the foundation office, and she'd taken a wrong turn, or something that felt like a wrong turn but was probably not accidental, and found herself on the street where she had lived for 9 years, in the house she had rented and furnished, and made into the shape of a life. She pulled over and sat with the engine running. The house looked the same. A different family was living in it now, visible in small details that meant nothing to anyone but her. A different color of curtains in the front window, a bicycle she didn't recognize leaning against the porch, a wreath on the door that her family would never have put there. The landlord had rented it within 2 weeks of her leaving. Of course he had. It was a good house in a decent neighborhood, and people needed houses. The eviction notice had been business. The vacancy had been filled, and the business had continued, and the house did not remember her. Houses don't, as a rule. They take the shape of whoever is in them, and when those people leave, the houses fill with someone else's shape, and the previous shape is gone, as if it was never there. She had carried that house in her chest for months after leaving it. The specific weight of losing it, which was not the weight of bricks or rent or the legal language of the notice, but the weight of the specific ordinary mornings. Coffee in the kitchen before the kids woke up, Marco's homework spread across the dining room table, or Rosa's piano practice drifting down from upstairs, all of it accumulated into something that felt irreplaceable. Sitting in her car in front of the house, she understood something she had not been able to understand while she was in the middle of losing it. The house had not been the life. The house had been where the life happened, which was entirely different. The life had been Marco and Rosa and her mother's phone calls and Diane's food and the particular stubbornness she carried in her spine that she'd inherited from people she'd never met. All of that had come with her. All of that was still intact. What she'd lost was an address. What she'd found was a building that would become an address for 48 other families. Families who needed what she had needed, which was a place to stand while they figured out the next thing. Although she put the car in drive and pulled away, she did not look back in the mirror. She did not need to. The call she had not expected came from Adela Weiss's granddaughter, a woman in her 30s named Yael, who was visiting New York from Tel Aviv for work, and who asked, through Dr. Eisenberg, whether Nora would be willing to meet. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown on a Thursday afternoon, Yael in the professional clothes of someone between business meetings, Nora in the kind of clothes she wore to foundation meetings, which were slightly more formal than her natural preference, but which she'd decided early on were part of how she communicated that the work was serious. Yael was warm and direct and had her grandmother's eyes, on which Nora noticed immediately and said nothing about, because it would have been too much to say in the first 5 minutes of meeting someone. They talked for 2 hours. Yael told her about growing up hearing fragments of the story from Adela, the pieces her grandmother had shared, and the larger silence around the pieces she hadn't. The way the absence of answers had shaped Adela's life, without either of them fully understanding the shape it was making. What it had meant, Yael said, to watch her grandmother receive the answer in her 80s. There is something that happened to her, Yael said, after Dr. Eisenberg called. After she spoke with you, she became lighter. I do not know how else to say this. She has always been a strong woman, strong in the way of people who have learned to carry things and not show the weight. But the weight of not knowing was something different and something additional. And when it was resolved, she became lighter. Like something was put down that she had been holding for 80 years without realizing she was holding it. She had not previously talked about her mother very much. After your conversation, she started. She would tell the grandchildren about Antwerp, about the street she grew up on, about the way the market smelled on Saturday morning. Small details she had kept inside for decades because talking about them meant touching the loss, and the loss had always been too large to touch safely. Now she talks about them. She has started writing some of them down. Nora held her coffee cup and listened. She thought about Hartwell writing in his ledger in multiple languages, through switching between them when the language he was in wasn't the right one for what he needed to say. She thought about what it means to write something down, to commit a private truth to a form that outlasts the moment, to trust that whatever comes after will be capable of receiving what was written. That is everything, Nora said, that she can talk about them now. Yael nodded. She wants you to know that what you did for her, returning the stones, handling the whole thing the way you did, she says it was not just a legal transaction. She says it was an act of respect, that you treated the history of those stones as what it was, which was not a financial matter, but a human matter. That is what she wanted me to tell you in person, because she felt it was too important to say in a letter. Nora looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Yael. Please tell her that I think about her mother often, the woman who gave the stones to Hartwell. What it took for her to extend that trust, in those circumstances, to a man she was putting all her remaining faith in. Tell her that her mother's trust was the foundation of everything, that without her mother's act of faith, none of the rest of this would have been possible, that her mother is part of what the building is. Yael's eyes filled. She said, I will tell her that. She will want to hear that very much. The conversation with Yael stayed with Nora for weeks. She found herself returning to it at odd moments, standing in the community hall, watching a job training session, sitting in her own kitchen in the apartment she had eventually moved into on the building's top floor, was a two-bedroom with windows looking east toward the river, simple and clean and entirely hers. She had not bought a large house or a spectacular property, or any of the things that people with sudden wealth were supposed to acquire to demonstrate that the wealth was real. She had moved into the building she had rebuilt on the principle that if she was asking other people to live there, she should be willing to live there herself, and on the further principle that she wanted to know the building the way a person knows a building when they are in it every day, the way the light moved through the community hall in the afternoon, the way the heating system sounded in the deep cold of January, the way the neighbors' voices carried in the stairwell in that specific acoustic of old industrial construction. It was a good building to live in, solid in the way Patricia had said. That first time, the density of something built by someone who believed what was inside it was worth protecting. That quality had not been the diamonds, she had come to understand. That quality had been Hartwell himself, the specific seriousness of a man who had learned what things cost and had built accordingly. The building held that quality in its structure, the way stone holds the cold of winter well into spring. She felt it every day and was grateful for it every day, in the specific way you are grateful for something you came close to not finding. Marco turned 14 in the spring, and his robotics team placed first at state competition. He called her from the venue before he called anyone else, his voice doing the thing it had done since he was small, when something was too large for composure, eye climbing in register and then catching itself, trying to be calm about something that wasn't a calm thing. They won, Mama. I know. Your coach texted me an hour ago. He said something that was mostly wordless. She laughed. Come home and tell me everything, she said. Every single part of it. He came home and told her every part of it, sitting at the kitchen table for 2 hours with the trophy on the table between them, explaining the challenge problem and the solution they'd built, and the moment in the final round when the mechanism they'd designed did exactly what it was supposed to do, and the judges' faces changed. Rosa sat on the counter and listened with the focused attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting, which included most things Marco explained. He was a good teacher. He had his mother's instinct for taking complex systems apart until they were understandable and putting them back together in language that made sense to people who hadn't spent months inside the problem. He would do something good with that, she thought, watching him. He already was. There was a woman named Paulette Harrison who moved into one of the third-floor apartments in February with her son Deshaun, who was 9, and her daughter Imani, who was 12. Paulette had been living in her car for 11 weeks. She had a job, a real job, a medical billing position that paid reasonably and had benefits. But the gap between what she earned and what Pittsburgh housing cost had been impossible to close since her landlord had sold the building she'd rented, and the new owners had raised the rent to a number that her salary, so without a second income, couldn't reach. She had family in the city, but not the kind of family situation where moving in temporarily was possible, and she had put her name on every affordable housing waitlist in the county and had been told the waits were 2 years minimum, 3 years likely, and had spent 11 weeks keeping her children's school attendance perfect and their uniforms clean and their faces normal from the outside, while the inside of their situation was the back of a Kia Sportage in a church parking lot whose pastor had agreed to look the other way. Nora met her at the intake appointment, which she attended for new residents when she could, because she believed in knowing the people the foundation was serving rather than knowing only the files. Paulette sat across the table with the particular posture of someone who has been managing a crisis for long enough that the management had become structural, built into the way she held her shoulders and the way she watched the door. She answered the intake questions with the brevity of someone who had learned that oversharing in official contexts had not historically worked in her favor. When the formal part of the intake was complete, Nora set down the clipboard and looked at her directly. "What do you need that we haven't asked about?" Paulette looked at her. The assessment of the question seemed to take a moment. Then she said, "My daughter hasn't had a bedroom in 11 weeks. She's been sleeping in the back seat, and she hasn't said anything about it. Not one complaint, but I can see it on her, the way she's holding herself. When 12-year-olds need their own space, they need a door they can close." Nora said, "She'll have one by Friday." Paulette looked at her for a moment longer. Then something in the structure of her shoulders changed, an almost invisible shift, the kind of change that happens when a weight that has been carried long enough to feel permanent is finally, provisionally set down. She said, "Thank you." Nora said, "You don't have to thank me. Just do the thing that comes after." Paulette's eyes were steady. What thing is that? Nora thought about Ezra Hartwell. She thought about her mother's kitchen. She thought about Marco on the sidewalk in the cold, saying this one has good bones. She thought about the wall that was 12 feet shorter than it should have been, and the cold chisel, and the sound the vault door made when it finally opened, and the bioluminescent light filling a room that had been dark for half a century. She thought about Adela Weiss becoming lighter. She thought about what it means to build something in the bedrock of a place and trust it to whoever comes next. "The thing that comes after," Nora said, "is whatever you build now that you have somewhere to stand." Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.